Hola everyone, it's Edith or Edith. Welcome to season 1, episode 3 of Cultura Convos, a space for stories and reflections of identidad y cultura meant to educate, inspire you, and entertain you. I really want this space to spark some of the hard conversations with ourselves and with others too. I do say with ourselves too, because I feel like that is priority first. And through personal reflections, stories, and conversations with other guests, this community is forming to help you become the best version of yourself by writing and rewriting your story. Instead of embarrassment, instead of fear, instead of shame. And our goal is that you begin to embrace and celebrate your cultural identity, your cultura, while also embracing other parts of your identity and reminding ourselves that we're not just one thing. We're not just our cultural identity, how we choose to identify. There are multiple parts to who we are. My name is Edith. You can also call me Edith. I am a mother. I am a daughter, a sister, a life partner. I'm the author of my debut children's book, Two Homes, Dos Casas, and Dos Casas. Right now, I'm also your host here at Cultura Convos. I am really passionate and interested about identidad, cultura. I love stories. I love listening to people's stories, which is why I am so excited for creating this community with Cultura Combos. At the end of each episode, my goal is that you will pause to reflect on your own story and begin or continue to write and rewrite your story from a place of strength. Most importantly, I want you to know and remember that you are smart, that you are joy, that you are capable and deserving, most of all, of experiencing heaven on earth. Really defining that for yourself as well. I think with social media, with life, with our circles, wherever we are, it can be so easy to try to chase something that is for someone else. And I think it's important that all these concepts of life, whether it's what success means, what your identity is, all of that we define for ourselves. So welcome. And in today's episode, I share part of my journey of how I started reconnecting with my roots. So I'm really excited to dive into that. It was fun making that outline and just really emphasizing the points that I want to make. I'll share more about how it hasn't always been really easy, but ultimately how this journey has really helped me create a sense of pride in my culture, really understanding more of my story, my parents' story, and my great grandparents' story, and learn more about myself as well. Learn more about my family. And again, going back to just writing and rewriting our story. So for me, when I think about when did my journey of reconnecting with my roots was, I often think that it goes back to conversations I started having in college. I was very fortunate that I grew up in Long Beach, California, a very diverse city where I was surrounded by, my cultura a lot. I grew up in a very diverse environment and maybe diverse, but also my circles were predominantly Mexican until I was in school in some ways. So for me, I didn't really realize how much of a blessing that was until I was older. How I grew up in an environment very blessed to be around a lot of Latinos, a lot of Mexicanos, and I'll say that it was really until college that I started kind of diving deeper into what this meant, having conversations around race, culture, ethnicity, all that. And really, when I started feeling like, wait a minute, I'm not the only one that feels like this. For example, I'm not the only one that, doesn't necessarily know if I want to say I'm Mexican or I'm Mexican American at the time, or, all these terms that I was basically learning, Hispanic, you learn the history of it. And I'm like, wait, I'm not sure if that aligns with me. So it was really when I started having those conversations at Cal State Dominguez Hills is a predominantly Black and Brown student population. And I will say, I feel like I learned so much from the students in my class, just listening, especially if there was people from other communities like the Black community that was, speaking, just hearing the different perspectives and realizing, wow, like that, I can relate to that because even as, whether we identify as Latinos, as Native, Indigenous, etc., we're so nuanced. Nothing is black and white, and we're not exactly the same. There's so many nuance to our stories. So for me, I think back to college. However, w- when I think of what really sparked me to get into, getting closer to my roots, starting to collect stories, it really was Peace Corps when I think of it a lot. I have recordings, and because of this episode, I was going back to what is my earliest recording when I started collecting stories. And I found one in 2013. However, I will say I started charging some old phones because I want to know if I started doing it even before that. However, 2013 was special because that year I was going to go live in Burkina Faso, West Africa for 2 years, really 27 months. So a few months, a few more months than just 2 years. And I went to visit my abuelita because I had an abuelita that, never came to the US. And I knew that I wasn't going to see her in a couple of years. So I went to visit her. I started recording stories. And I really think it was more from like, wow, I'm not going to see my grandma in a while. And I want to have memories of her. When I was in Peace Corps, specifically when I was living in Burkina Faso, that's where things changed for me. And Peace Corps, for those of you that might not be familiar, it's a program through the US government. Rules have changed over time. At the time, you did have to be a college graduate or have a certain number of years of experience in a specific field. For me, I had just graduated from Cal State Dominguez Hills. I applied, I got accepted, and I was like, you know, I'm okay with going to a Latin American country, and I'm also open to experiencing a whole different country and learning a whole different language, etc. So I went to Burkina Faso, and what was interesting about being in Burkina Faso is that I felt so at home in many ways. Even though it was so far from home, it reminded me of Mexico a lot. My parents are from, a village, so in some ways it reminded me of that feel, like that community feel, that collectivistic culture, which is more group and community instead of, US culture is very individualistic, so it's very I, me first. And that was really, really awesome. Even the stories, I feel like I got a chance for some of my dad's stories to come to life. So, for example, my dad talked about how he used to, take care of the animals really young. He had a job really young, maybe like 7, 8 years old, and he would like, go find the vacas. And I was like, wow, like one day I was sitting in my courtyard and I saw this little kid, like 7 or 8 with a herd of goats and, just putting the goats, taking them to where they sleep. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like that's literally my dad's story. And I'm like seeing a snippet of it, because even though now I cherish a lot of the stories, I feel like as a kid or growing up, sometimes whenever your parents are telling your stories, you're kind of just like, bro, like, I don't know. I don't think I was that interested, to be real. Like, I remember a lot of them, but sometimes, like, I'm just kind of like, oh my gosh. Like, my dad one time took us to Bakersfield to introduce us to this woman who, like, really helped him when he was a farm worker because that was one of his earlier jobs. And I'm like, I don't even think I think I just said hi. I was like a kid. And now I realize what he was doing, like, really sharing a part of his story and sharing a person and thanking a person that helped him so much, and now he was circling back with kids that were young and in their teens. So for me, being in Burkina Faso, the people were amazing, and I felt like it reminded me of home so much that not just of Mexico, but just like our community and what I grew up with and, growing up in Long Beach, that it was like seeing so much beauty in their culture allowed me to see the beauty in my culture. And it's funny because I didn't have electricity and I did have solar panels. So I remember my dad at one point was like, Mija, like literally, like we came to the US and now you're literally going back to probably how they grew up. I think he said like, yeah, like how I was when I was a kid with like no electricity and things like that. So yeah, that was kind of funny. But yeah, so my experience was awesome. And I feel like that connection of like being so far from home, but feeling so at home and seeing so much beauty in this culture really sparked this curiosity to want to learn more about my own culture because I was learning so much about the culture just by living there. And that was really pivotal. So when I came back, I felt like grad school was a second point that allowed me to dive into this. So I ended up getting a dual master's, MBA, and then public policy. And with the public policy, because you're learning a lot about the history, government, et cetera, policies, someone gave me the best advice and was like, look, whenever you get a subject to write about, just ask the professor if you can write about something that you're interested in, right? Like, even if the prompt is like something where you're like, I'm not interested in that, maybe you can change it to something you are. And little by little, that's what I started doing. So I started writing about, Dolores Huerta. I wrote about the braceros. And when I wrote about the braceros, and the bracero program, I learned that two of my grandpas were braceros. And I kind of collected that story where my grandma at the time, now they've both passed. She said, Mija, like, I'm actually in the process of trying to get some of your grandpa's money because a lot of the money never really made it to the people. And so that's like a whole nother subject. However, in this process and in this journey, even though grad school was not all fun and games, and I had a lot of experiences that I'll share at some point that were not the best, I did have a community that made it really, really awesome. And then when it came to connecting with my roots, connecting with my story, I took every opportunity to learn more. I co-founded Sin Fronteras with a friend, and we had events. We had opportunities to dive more into our culture, whether it was Dias de los Muertos, whether it was hosting a Dolores Vuelta documentary, was it's amazing, things like that. So in this journey, I was just gaining more and more knowledge and pride and realizing, wow, I come from amazing people. Like, I come from really dope people. And, I did grow up in a household that, I was proud of being, Mexican. I was proud of my culture. My parents, had the blessing of being able to take us to Mexico multiple times. So there was a lot that I did see, yet still it almost felt like, how some people describe it sometimes where maybe in my circles I was that, but beyond that, like in the workplace or in school, I wasn't really, wearing my cultura on my sleeve type of style. And over time, really, I have where it's like as I go into this journey, trying to be more authentic with who I am and you know, sh- not hide parts of my story because I feel like shame or embarrassment or whether it's my cultural heritage or something else. It's more of like, no, like embracing different parts of who I am and choosing to share it with who I want to share it. And that's it. So for me, these moments were pivotal and really sparked my curiosity and my want to learn more. I want to learn more about history. I love different cultures, so I want to learn more about other cultures and really starting with learning more about my own. So now I'm back from Peace Corps. I am in grad school, and I literally remember being so excited to collect all these stories. Like, I'm going to collect stories of my dad, of my abuelita. I'm going to collect stories of my tia. And the thing about it is that one, I was thinking about it very formally. And two, I realized I was making a lot of assumptions and had expectations of what it was going to be basically instead of just letting it go with the flow. So for example, I remember I really wanted the story of one of my tias, because I was like, I want to know like how she learned English, like what sparked her interest. So I, booked a lunch with her. I was going to say, tia, I'm going to hit record and I just want to ask you questions. And I remember asking her like, what inspired you to learn English? And, me thinking like it's going to be this deep answer and, I'm going to capture this thing and this story. And then she's like, oh, es que quería aprender a ordenar, hamburguesas y papitas. And I'm like, wait, what? She was like, oh, I wanted to learn how to, order burger and fries. And I'm like, oh, okay. Uh, Maybe I should ask a bit more of an open-ended question. I guess that is open-ended, but it was just like, wow, like I literally thought it was gonna look different. Or even with my dad and my mom, like there's just been similar questions that I'll ask, and I think it's gonna be the super deep answers, like, oh no, mija, fue fácil. Oh no, una aventura, and it's like, wait, what? So one, kind of releasing that expectation, but also realizing that for me, I kind of pivoted to make it a little bit more organic because another thing that happened one time is sometimes they got really deep to the point that the person began to cry, right? And I felt a little bit like, wait a minute, am I being selfish? Like, I want to collect these stories. And obviously, the person agreed, like, to share the story. But then in the moment, I didn't feel like I had the tools to support them. I wanted to do more. And, I realized that within our family, there are a lot of deep emotions. Perhaps they've never talked about this, or they realize, wait, I don't want to talk about it. There's a lot of emotion. And the more I collected stories, the more I started notice, or at least trying to collect stories, the more I noticed this. I noticed that there was a lot of violence in the story. There was a lot of really deep emotions in a lot of ways. It wasn't all, joy. And it kind of discouraged me a little bit because I felt like, wait a minute, I don't want to make people sad. I don't want to make people, you know, feel pressure to share something that they don't really want to share. So creating that environment to also kind of stop, which I did have to do a couple times, and I feel like that discouraged me. So then I started really just collect them more organically. So whether it was a conversation and there was a topic that I was interested in or I felt it was really important, I'm like, wait a minute, can I record this? Or oh, can you share more about that? And then I would take notes. And then I'm also been trying to be more intentional with video recording. I remember my abuelita during like Thanksgiving and Christmas time, she would have that old school, like big old recorder, and she would just be recording. And I feel like those are also like really awesome ways to capture, moments. And I feel like with their phones, yes, you can capture clips. There's something about, just capturing kind of like a movie style, right? That I've been thinking about going back to. So that was really what my journey was in collecting the stories. And I feel like I did stop. And now I'm trying to be more intentional with how I want to do that and where do I want to store them. It's not a linear journey of like, again, all fun, but it's allowed me to really get to know more about my family, more about my roots, and I really feel like it's allowed me to create this sense of pride in my culture and embracing different aspects of my culture and my identity, right? And some of it has been directly through the family, but there's also other research I've done through, whether it's searching online, finding different platforms, asking questions when I'm in Mexico, looking at things like that. Like, for example, starting with the region of Mexico that I know my family was born in this case, Michoacan. So for me, that has been a really positive thing in my life, even when again there's deep emotions, sadness, and learning things that are not necessarily the most joyous. I don't know if that's a word, but that only bring me joy. Now, what have I learned along the way? One of the things that I've learned along the way is that even our parents have been disconnected from their culture, right? Like you can think of it as like getting stories from my immediate family or my great grandparents, if I can, or my grandparents, etc. It's like how far back do we go, right? You can continue searching online. There's like different ways and angles to take it, just learning about the history in general. And for me, one of the things, that I learned, like even when the movie Coco came out, I was fell in love and I learned so much about my culture because my family's actually from that same region, very close to where that movie was studied and then, filmed and then, created, etc. And I remember hosting a Dia de los Muertos Zoom call that I opened up to friends and then one that I opened up directly to the family where we shared stories, etc. Nonetheless, my dad was like, ah, mija, he shared some stories and then started saying how he was really happy and very inspired by our generation because in a lot of ways our generation is going back to those roots, reconnecting more with our roots. And, if we look at history, obviously we have to remember, like, even our parents, because of colonization, they've been disconnected in their own ways. Yes, we've learned a lot about our cultura through them. And so there's a lot we haven't. I know with Dia de los Muertos, for example, my grandma would go to the grave and always talked about le voy a llevar flores a tu abuelita, etc. But having an altar and really a celebration, we didn't really do that. And I have other friends who are like, girl, we grew up doing that. So for me, I know that that is a very, very important part of our culture. Again, because I know that in that region that my family is from, this is such a big celebration. The other thing I've learned in this journey is that I've had to remind myself that getting closer to my roots, embracing my cultural identity doesn't necessarily have to mean that I take everything from our cultura, right? Not everything feels like, "Oh, I wanna not even embrace, but, like, not everything feels like, 'Oh, this is part of my cultura, therefore I'm gonna do it.'" No, I feel like a part of it is letting go of certain things too. Letting go of certain parts that are don't longer serve us, that don't necessarily align with us and our values, because again, not everything is positive. And I think that means also letting go of certain things and saying, you know what, I'm not going to continue that. The other thing is, I remember when me and my friend were the co founders of Sin Fronteras, and at some point, one of the members mentioned, like, this idea of like certain, you know, Latinos not speaking Spanish and being less quote unquote Mexican or Latino because they didn't like basically like how could they not speak Spanish? And there's a lot of reasons why someone won't speak Spanish. But my mentor at the time, because I was working with the chief diversity officer at the time as a student, he mentioned I asked him about it. Like as a leader, I wanted to make sure that I responded to this situation in the best way. And one thing he said was like, the moment we really start putting all these rules, we're also creating this hierarchy that already exists in our community, right? Whether it's like certain countries are better than others or certain Spanish is better than others, like all those things like creates this hierarchy and this separation. And really at the end of the day, that's not our goal. So I say that to say in this journey, I've also reminded myself and learned that, wait a minute, I am of this culture simply because of who I am a daughter of, which is something that the therapist I had made me, realize or embrace. Uh, I don't have to quote unquote dress a certain way or listen to certain type of music, or talk a certain type of way. Like I already am simply because of who I am and where I come from, and that's it. The Spanish is not going to make me more or less. Yes, I do agree and believe that languages are beautiful, and the more languages we know, I think that's powerful, and it brings a connection that a lot of other things perhaps do not and bring differently. Ultimately, not feeling like I have to do certain things because that's the thing that's going to make me more of this or more of that. So that's another thing that has been really important for me. And I'll pause there. And now, as I begin to close this reflection, the other thing is that this is a lifelong journey. If you are in this journey, if you decide to, dive in more into this journey in the sense of maybe collect stories, learn more about your roots, whether that's with a family member or you start online, etc., this is a lifelong journey. I don't think I had thought about it in this way, but it really changes because I think for a while I was like trying to figure out or like trying to get closer to my roots, but almost feeling like there was a quote unquote end destination in some ways. And I feel like, no, like our identity is a evolving thing. It's a lifelong journey when it comes to, other parts of our identity and definitely our cultural identity, right? If I go back, I remember, growing up, I would always say I was Mexican, like as a kid, and then going to Mexico and being like, no, no eres mexicana, eres del norte. And then if it was an older person, like if you didn't say that, it's like, well, wait, why are you not saying that? Like, tienes vergüenza. So over time, realizing like how I choose to identify has also changed the more I learn, right? And, whether it's Mexican or Mexican American, then Hispanic, and then no, never mind, then Latina, there's Latinx, Latina, like all these, the more I learn, the more I decide, even sometimes depending on the context, what aligns with me. So, for example, I learned that, where I am from is Purepecha, right? Like that is the population that is still exists today, that is in that region of Michoacan, to the point that literally the name of where my parents are from is written in Purepecha, right? And at the same time where I am in my journey, I'll say I have Purepecha roots. And there is something powerful sometimes when I think like, wow, like I am Purepecha in my own being. Now, to go out there and now say I am Purepecha is, if it still doesn't feel like I can say that, which I know I have to dig deeper into that. And I know that, there's probably multiple reasons. But this is in some ways, the reality of it, and in some ways, the complexity, the nuances. And that is where I am in my journey. And the more I learn, the more that may pivot. One thing I have realized that for me, I am embracing different parts of my identity. So I celebrate my culture. I love where I come from. I mean, when I'm in Mexico, I love to travel. So it's other countries too. But now there is something special of being in Mexico and, being in Michoacan and, having mariachi around. There's something that for me is special and I love. At the same time, what I have embraced and what I've realized in the past years is that first, I am a child of God, and that is above all. Like above all, that's where I start. And we live in a society where at the end of the day, especially when it comes to race, it's man-made, right? So there is this, part of me that knowing that I am a child of God is feels freeing, feels right. And then the other identities, they evolve, they change, so for me, that is what has resonated. So I invite you to click into your roots, your story. This can be through online research, by talking to a family member. Really, it doesn't even have to start with somebody else, like start with you. So if you want to, journal, talk through in a voice memo part of your story, it could be like, what were 5 pivotal moments in my life? Or like, who are the people that have really had a big impact in my life and where I am? Things like that. You can always begin writing your story. And as you write it, you'll learn more about yourself. You'll learn more about how you perceive your own story, how you can change it and reframe it in a way that serves you for the best. And you don't have to start with the deep stories. That's where I thought I wanted to start and then realized I pivoted. So it can be with fun stories. It could be stories where you're in a family gathering and somebody says a funny story and you could say, "Oh, can I record that real quick?" Or, "Oh, can you say it again?" And you can write about it. So I invite you to do that. And if any of this brought you chills, a smile, or interest you in any way, add Cultura Convos to your list of podcasts and share it with a friend. Clip it up, share it on social media. I look forward to hearing from you through the comments or messages after each episode. Thank you so much. In the next episode, I'm also going to talk about Two Homes, Dos Casas, my debut children's book. I'll share a little bit more about how that idea sparked and how I made it happen. And then a now funny story will also be in the upcoming episodes, and it'll touch a little bit about how we try to fit in since a really young age. I have a story of when I was in 4th grade and definitely tried to fit in. I'm also excited for beginning to introduce guests into the podcast. So I'm in the process of setting that up. So thank you so much for listening. This is season 1 of Cultura Combos, episode 3. If you are on Instagram, you can follow at It's Edith Suarez, and I will be uploading these videos on YouTube and then on the podcast platforms. So thank you so much. Remember that there is no one thing that defines you, and you are greatness. So have a wonderful, wonderful week.